Are we on Facebook now and YouTube? We should be live. David, one thing that we've just kind of learned is, in the very first session, we had some technical issues and we all freaked out. And now it's like we know that like 99% of our viewers come after the fact. So I just edit this out as soon as it's over. So if something happens, if there's a technical glitch or something, like, don't even worry about it. Just we'll deal with it on the fly, and I'll edit it out later.
Sounds good.
Okay. All right. Let me just make sure we're live on Facebook here.
Dr. K, you're live on YouTube.
Awesome. Facebook too? Okay, cool. We're ready to go. Okay, we're recording. Okay. Dr. Squires, you ready to go?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, good evening and welcome everybody back to the University of St. Thomas's Summer Theology Lecture Series, Truth and Tradition, first annual. We'll be back next year. We've organized this series of talks to highlight the new MA program at the University of St. Thomas in theology. And really our mission is to be deep in tradition. We take people always reading the tradition through scripture, through the magisterium, but deep into St. Augustine and Boethius, the Eastern Fathers, Bonaventure Aquinas, St. John Henry Newman, and on, all the way through the tradition. This is just what we do. And we're continuing this tonight with a very special lecture. And this is actually part 2 on the soul. We have 2 lectures on the soul. So if you haven't seen part 1, which was 2 weeks ago, Father Raphael Mary Salzillo, you need to go back and watch that because it was a really, really outstanding lecture. And all of our videos are on the Facebook page. They're also on our YouTube channel, UST Theology. And so tonight's guest is going to build on some of those themes that were developed and deepen them. So I'm very proud to introduce my colleague, Dr. David Squires. Dr. Squires is an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. He's been here since 2019 with a PhD from the University of Notre Dame from their Department of Philosophy. He also has master's degrees in early Christian studies, also from Notre Dame, and from the medieval studies department, likewise from the University of Notre Dame. His philosophical interests are wide-ranging, ancient and medieval philosophy, topics in contemporary metaphysics, and his primary areas of research are in philosophies of perception and ethics. He's also been a principal instructor for many courses in ancient philosophy, medieval philosophy, introduction to philosophy and ethics for Notre Dame's Department of Philosophy and for the program of liberal studies. He was awarded the Kanab Center for Teaching and Learning's Outstanding Teacher Award in 2018 and for his ancient and medieval philosophy course, and he was nominated for UST's Excellence Award in Teaching in his first year here at UST. He also enjoys teaching philosophy of the human person nowadays, and as well as courses in the honors program. And he runs a Greek group. And in his spare time, if you haven't guessed this already, you're not going to be surprised. In his spare time, he likes to read philosophy and study Greek and Latin, as well as with students in various settings, and in addition to enjoying the great outdoors. So, Dr. Squires, it's really a pleasure to have you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Dr. Kerwin. I appreciate the invitation and that wonderful intro, as well as that flyer you made with the Rembrandt. I can see that he's praying, please don't let the soul be outmoded. So thank you. All right. So today I'm going to be talking about whether the notion of the soul is outmoded, whether it's something that we should sort of consign to the dustbin on account of things in contemporary science. And what I'm going to do is take a quick look at some popular, I I won't call them atheists, although they are atheists. They're more apsychists, right? They're people who say that there is no soul. And I'm going to introduce you to them through two videos. I'll show two just so that you know that I'm not saying that this is just something that one of them idiosyncratically says, but it's a very common theme among people to say things like you're about to see. So we'll be looking at videos here from Susan Blackmore, a psychologist, and also Sam Harris, a philosopher and neuropsychologist. So let me go ahead and share screen here, and we'll just watch these videos. It'll take about 4 minutes, and then I will say more about them when they're done. So here we go.
Sue, I've been talking to many cosmologists, and whether they happen to be atheists or theists, virtually everyone points to consciousness, if I push them hard enough, as something that resides at the most fundamental level. I've been shocked at how many people, how many physicists use consciousness as the most fundamental thing in the universe.
Well, some of them I know are just waffling and making nonsense of it. People swing wildly between materialism and idealism with consciousness. I think we have to start from how it feels. It feels like there's an immortal soul. It feels as though what's important about me is that I'm conscious. There's things I'm conscious of, and there's me. And that me is something that feels as though it lives in the body and has free will and can, you know, make my arms move, that sort of thing. It just seems to feel that way. But you then go and look in a brain, and what do you find? I mean, you know what you'll see in there, don't you? Actually, I've never looked in my own brain, but you will see a great kind of porridgey mass in there of billions of neurons connected up in billions of ways. How can a soul be there? The more we understand about the brain, the further neurophysiology and neuroscience progresses, the less room there is for a soul, or even for a self. Because all of the jobs that were previously given to the soul, being conscious, causing actions, thinking, having insight, thinking up new ideas, being creative, all of those things, we are beginning to see how the brain does them. You know, the old-fashioned view is absolutely, I'm a spirit or a soul, and I'm important, and I might even live forever. That's the kind of starting point for all human cultures. And in science, it's forcing us, as it forced us to see that the Earth is not the center of the universe, and you know, we're not the only reason for life on this planet. It's forcing us, I think, to come to that truth. We're not a spirit, we're not a soul, we're not even a little self inhabiting our brains.
But having no souls, no spirits, nothing non-physical as part of the picture.
No, nothing non-physical in that sense of you know, something in another dimension or some sort of waffly little spirits, and not that sort of thing.
I love Susan Blackmore's energy. I want to show one more here. This is Sam Harris. And then when I'm done, I want to talk about some things that they hold in common. So here's another quick share.
There's a false assumption about science operating here. Science is not in principle committed to the idea that there's no afterlife, or that the mind is identical to the brain, right, or that materialism is true. Science is completely open to whatever in fact is true. And if it's true that the consciousness is being run like software on the brain and can, by virtue of ectoplasm or something else we don't understand, can be dissociated from the brain at death, that would be part of our growing scientific understanding of the world if we could discover it. Now, and there are ways we could in fact discover that if it were true. The problem is there are very good reasons to think it's not true. And we know this from now 150 years of neurology, where you damage areas of the brain and faculties are lost. And they're clearly, it's not that everyone with brain damage has their soul perfectly intact, they just can't get the words out. This is everything about your mind can be damaged by damaging the brain. You can cease to recognize faces, you can cease to know the names of animals, but you still know the names of tools. I mean, the fragmentation in the way in which our mind is parcellated at the level of the brain is not at all intuitive, and there's a lot known about it. And what we're being asked to consider is that you damage one part of the brain, and the mind, something about the mind and subjectivity is lost. You damage another, and yet more is lost. And yet if you damage the whole thing at death, we can rise off the brain with all our faculties intact, recognizing grandma and speaking English. Now,
I'm surprised by the standing ovation. I mean, he effectively, if he's right, has just proven that death is the end. Hardly worth a standing ovation. But I think probably we should think of him as the audience is thinking that he's spoken the truth, and so applauding him, even if it's a truth we don't want to hear, namely that death is the end. But what I want to do here first is just collect up, because these are representative speakers. These are people that are popular on YouTube and are also, scholars. So we can gather up some things that I think they share in common. It's hard to do this. They have, oftentimes there's such, it can be bewildering to sort of sort through things and find what's in common. But I think we can start here by saying that they definitely agree about some things. And what is it that they agree about? And so I'll pull out 2 points. First, I think they agree about what they think those who posit soul, or say that affirm soul's existence, they agree about what those people are saying. And there's 3 points I'd like to pull out here. I think they agree that those who affirm the existence of the soul suspect that there is some mysterious, immaterial inhabitant of bodies. And this, as you can see, for Blackmore is offensive to science, right? At the end, she says, no, nothing like that. No fairies, none of this immaterial stuff. I think both of them also hold, secondly, that the soul is identical to the individual or the person. This is clear in Blackmore's saying that, it seems obvious that we are these, things just living in our bodies, right? We have bodies, but we are some kind of immaterial existence living in the body. And also in Harris is saying at the end, we rise off our bodies once the brain is fully damaged by death, speaking English and recognizing grandmother. So it's whatever this immaterial reality is, it's something that is identical to the human person or to the individual. And they also agree, I think, that those who affirm the existence of the soul are affirming that the soul is an agent, which is to say that it performs certain operations. Which operations? Well, those that are what we would call conscious operations, right? Sensing, imagining, thinking, willing. And they think that those who posit soul are positing the soul because we have to have something that's able to do those things, right? And if we don't posit an immaterial soul, then what exactly is it that's doing all of these important conscious operations? And again, I would cite, actually, they both say this explicitly. Blackmore says, being creative, etc. And Harris says, we rise off recognizing grandma and speaking English. So again, he thinks that this supposed soul is an agent, something that's performing operations. So I would also think that they agree in why we shouldn't affirm the existence of the soul, right? If that's what people who say that the soul exists mean when they say it, then we shouldn't agree with them, right? We shouldn't agree with those who say that there's a soul. And the reason for that is that empirical science shows us that it's a body that's performing these conscious operations, right? We can see that when someone's angry, the amygdala is active, right? So obviously it is a part of our bodies that's performing that operation of being angry and not some kind of immaterial soul. And indeed, we just are the bodies that are performing those operations, right? We perform those operations like get angry or think, and it's a body that performs those operations like get angry or think. And so we are bodies, not immaterial souls. That's, I think, the claim that's coming from them here. And what I want to do for this lecture is essentially investigate this question. Do the considerations raised by Blackmore and Harris, are they damning for the doctrine of the soul? Right? Is the soul outmoded once we consider what they've had to say about it? Should we abandon it? Like phlogiston or the electromagnetic ether, are these ideas, that were, they ultimately belong in the dustbin of, even if at first promising, ultimately bad ideas. And I'm going to reply to that in two ways. First, in general, and is soul outmoded in general? And then I'd like to focus specifically on the Aristotelian tradition, right, which is also the Thomistic tradition, and a rare instance where philosophy has even made it into council, right? So the Council of Vienne defines the soul as the form of the body. So it should be of interest to Catholics for sure, but anyone interested in these doctrines. So first, we'll deal with the question of the soul in general. Is the soul in general outmoded, given the considerations that we've just pulled out of these lectures by Blackmore and Harris? And I want to say it's not. There is most certainly something that answers to the name of soul. And here's reasons for thinking so. Let's begin with what's most obvious. There's a difference between living and non-living things. Living things perform living operations, such as growing, perceiving, thinking, imagining, and non-living things don't, right? I perform some of these operations, but this headset, not so much. So the difference between living and non-living things is obvious. And this difference, moreover, is not something that has no explanation. It's not a brute fact, right? If someone said, well, what's the difference really between living and non-living things? It wouldn't be a good answer to say, well, don't ask, right? There's no explanation for that difference whatsoever. And so what we should affirm is that since there's going to be an explanation, that there must be some principle or cause of the difference. In other words, there's some principle or cause of living operations, like growing, perceiving, thinking, in living things. There is some principle of those operations in living things which is not in non-living things. Let's call that principle soul. Therefore, there is soul. Now, some of you probably feel swindled by this reasoning, and that's because this is what we'd call the nominal definition of soul. I think it's accurate, but it's not particularly informative, right? Many different kinds of theories of exactly what the soul is in its essence might be compatible with that reasoning. In fact, in the history of philosophy, there's plenty of examples of this. Take Democritus, for example. He thought that the soul was little round atoms bouncing around inside empty spaces in the body, and that the reason we get up to get a drink of water or think is because of these atoms and the way that they move around. He was a corporealist about soul. He thought soul was a certain kind of body. Plato, on the other hand, thought that it was an immaterial substance, not a body at all, and completely capable of existing independent of bodies. And Aristotle, of course, thought that it was the substantial form of the body, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But any of these different theories of the soul is compatible with that nominal definition. Each person, whether they say that the soul is a certain kind of body, an immaterial substance, the form of a body, each one is affirming that it is the first principle of life in living things. So there definitely is something that answers to that question. In fact, maybe someone like Blackmore could hold that it's DNA. But we shouldn't say that there's nothing that answers to that definition. Otherwise, we're positing that there's no explanation for the difference between living and non-living things. So I think that's my answer to whether soul is in general destroyed by what's said here. Certainly it isn't. There is something that answers to the name of soul, a first principle of life in living things. One more time, if you want to hear my reasoning on this again, there is a difference between living and non-living things. That difference is not brute. There's an explanation for it. Therefore, there's a principle of life, of living operations in living things. Which principle or source is missing in non-living things? Let's call that soul. Well, then that's soul. As a last thought to clarify this, I might compare it to happiness in a way. Perhaps everyone can agree that happiness or thriving is that at which all action, all human action aims. But that doesn't that doesn't really show exactly what happiness is, right? People could still disagree. Some think it's money, others fame, others the intellectual life. So the nominal definition is fine for showing that there is such a thing, but not as a real definition. So I want to move on more specifically now to talk about soul in the Aristotelian tradition. Is this particular conception of soul outmoded given the considerations in the videos that we just watched? And here I think that I'm trying to extend some of the things that Father Raphael Mary talked about 2 weeks ago. He approached the notion of soul through the question of change. And he's right to do that. Certainly, soul is an explanation, a formal principle in explaining change. But here I'm going to approach it a little bit differently through the notion of a principle of unity. And I want to begin just by briefly talking about Aristotle's category theory. This is a fundamental piece of Aristotelian doctrine, which is that there are certain most general categories of things that objects in the world or things in the world fall into. And I'll give you an example. If we pick something like the red of my pillow over here, this here red that's on the pillow, we can go more and more general. This red is a red, and red is a color, and color is a quantity or quality. Sorry. And according to Aristotle, we can't go much further than that. But I've found that red is a kind of quality, and I can do the same thing for something that's this can might be 4 inches. This 4 inches, well, which is a kind of quantity. Continuous quantity, which is a kind of quantity. So each time we go out, we're finding more and more general things into which everything that we can talk about falls. And he comes up with 10 categories. I won't name them all here, but they're substance. I'll give you a few: substance, quality, quantity, relation, where, when, and several others. This category framework is important because most of the categories are what we might call accidental forms. They're characterizations of substance. So quality, like red, is just a characterization of the pillow, or a quantity like 4 inches is a characterization of the can. One of these categories really stands out, though, and this is the category of substance. And what Aristotle means by substance is not sort of the way we talk about it. For us, substance is something you can shake in a test tube. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were crawling around in some kind of substance. For Aristotle, I am a substance. My cat Alice is a substance. The fern over here is a substance. A quantity of water is a substance. These are all things that have accidents from the other categories. And what I want to do now is focus a little bit on the category of substance. Again, examples of primary substance include my cat Alice. When we talk about primary substance, we're saying that it's the primary existent, right? It's that thing according to which all those other things exist. They only exist because they exist in it. There wouldn't be any colors or quantities or anything like that if there weren't things like me or Alice to be colored or to be quantified. And so substance is a primary existent, and it's also a case of, like a paradigmatic case of corporeal unity. Now, what do I mean by that? As I move forward, what I'm working toward is a notion of a definition of the soul. So I'll give you some examples of things that are not very good. These are definitely cases of non-substantial unity. Consider me and my philosopher's pallor, right? I'm pale. I've been in the library too much reading. Pale me is not a substance. I'm a substance, but not pale me. Gosh, if pale me were a substance, then so would sitting me and 6'1" me. There'd be a whole lot of Squireses, right? And there's really only one. So it's this here primary substance that's the only primary substance here. But it's not just combinations of accidents and substance that turn out not to be substances. Here's another example. Suppose that I hold my girlfriend's hand, which I frequently do. And suppose that my mother thinks that we're cute. Clearly, she thinks that we are cute, right? She and I. Here's something that she doesn't think. She doesn't think the thing that has me and my girlfriend as parts is cute. And the reason for that is there is no thing that has me or my girlfriend as parts, right? All we are is two separate substances. And, you might think that I could find out how things are unified by using a different kind of method, right? I might think, well, what if I superglued myself? What if I superglued my hand to my girlfriend's hand in the name of philosophy? Two things would immediately result. I'd probably find that she was my ex-girlfriend. And secondly, what I would find is that there's still no thing that has both she and I as parts, right? Because there's a two-ness there. There's one substance, her, and one me. And we never do get anything that's composed of both. So a question arises for us here. How do we get to say that I am one substance, right? I have many parts. Why will it not turn out that I am just sort of like a lot of people holding hands, right? What makes all the parts of me to be substantially one being? And this is where we get to a notion of soul in Aristotle. Now, you could say, as many of the pre-Socratic philosophers said, that nothing does. And what that means is that things that we thought were unified substances, like myself, like my cat Alice, like my fern, they turn out just to be heaps of elemental substances. Now, our ancient philosophers didn't know the periodic table or anything about modern physics, but they said everything's earth, air, fire, and water. They just reduced everything to its elements and denied that there were substances other than the elements. But that's something that Aristotle refuses to do. Aristotle wants to leave room for us to affirm that there are substances such as Alice or me or the fern. And what his way of doing this is, of course, substantial form, right? Substantial form is a cause of existence of non-elemental substances. And of course, in living things, the soul will end up being the substantial form, because for living things, to be and to be alive are the same. This is a difficult doctrine, and in order to make plain what he's talking about, Aristotle gives us a couple helpful analogies. So one of them that I'll give here is the eye analogy. He says, if the eye were an animal, sight would have been its soul. The power of sight would have been its soul. And what he's claiming here is that the power of sight is that which makes an eyeball to be an eyeball. If the power of sight is removed, the eyeball is no longer a body of that kind anymore. Rather, it's only an eyeball in name. It's only an eyeball in the sense that a statue has an eyeball, but it's not truly an eyeball. And what he's trying to get us to grasp through this analogy is that as sight is that which makes an eyeball to be an eyeball, so the soul is that which causes a body of a certain kind to exist. It's that which causes my body to be and to be one. Indeed, this simple essence, the soul, it's without parts, so it's not a body. It's something that must be present to every part of my body. And if it weren't present to every part of my body, giving each of the parts and indeed the whole body existence, then those wouldn't be the parts of my body. So Aristotle, in positing the soul, is looking to give an explanation for the unity of non-elemental substances like me, like Alice, who's currently begging to be on camera, and like my fern, as well as things like earth or fire. So this is the reason for positing soul as the cause of existence of organic bodies, of living bodies. Now, an important thing to realize about this, what's called hylomorphic idea, is that Just as the eye is not the power of sight alone, but rather it's the eyeball along with the power of sight. It's both together that make an eye. So the animal is not the soul alone, but is the combination of the soul and the body that it causes to exist. And so this is a hylomorphic notion of animals. That's a fancy word meaning matter and form. The form is the soul, the matter is the body that it causes to exist. So this is kind of an extension of some of the things that Father was saying, although again, looking at it through the question of the unity of bodies, rather than a question of change. And what I want to do now is just return, after having considered these things, to to the issues raised by Dr. Harris and Dr. Blackmore. I would like to see whether or not those considerations have any force, against this conception of soul. And originally, I pulled out 3 ideas that were central to their account, right, of what people who say that soul exists are affirming about it. And I named those things immateriality, identity, and operation. Right? They said that those who say that soul exists are saying that there's something immaterial, non-bodily, inhabiting the body, that this just is identical to the person or to the individual, and that this thing is the thing that's the agent. It's what's operating. It's what's doing our operations. With those things in mind, we can ask now whether or not what they've said has any force against the soul as it's conceived in the Aristotelian tradition. And I think that it's pretty obvious that it doesn't have much force, right? Let's begin with the idea of operation. So according to Blackmore and Harris, as I said, it seems that the soul is the thing that's performing our conscious operations, right? And that people who posit the soul are positing it in order for it to perform those operations. But as we just saw, that isn't the reason that the soul is posited in the Aristotelian tradition, not at all. It's posited as a cause of the unity of substantial bodies. Now, I suppose it's possible that even if it was posited for that reason, it turns out that it's also the thing which is doing our conscious operations. And in that sense, maybe they would have something to, against the Aristotelian tradition. But strictly speaking, it isn't the soul that's performing our conscious operations. In the Aristotelian tradition, form is a principle of operation, but not an agent. And I'll give some examples to try to make this clear. Consider the healthy pumping of the blood. What is it that's the agent here that's pumping the blood? Well, it's going to be the heart. No doubt the healthy heart healthfully pumps blood because it has health, a certain formal condition that it's in. And so health is responsible for the healthy pumping of blood, but it's not the agent that's doing it, right? Health didn't pump any blood. It's just that by which the heart pumps blood. We can have another example, one that doesn't use a body, but uses the mind. Consider someone doing geometry like Euclid. Euclid's mind is sort of the subject, but the form here would be his knowledge of geometry. Not every mind has that knowledge, but his does. But the knowledge, the form, isn't doing geometry, right? Euclid's knowledge isn't doing geometry. Euclid is doing geometry, and he's doing it because he has a certain form, namely the knowledge. And so it isn't going to turn out to be the case that in the Aristotelian tradition, the soul is an agent that's performing living operations, that's being creative, being conscious, recognizing grandma and speaking English, right? That's not the soul that's doing these things, but it's that by which the substance itself is doing those things. The soul is that by which Socrates does the things that he does. It's that by which Alice the cat does the things that she does, but it's not the thing doing them. So it's not correct then, as Harris and Blackmore assert, that those who assert the soul, all of them anyway, assert that it is an agent that performs conscious operations. Next, it's not true with respect to the Aristotelian tradition that the soul just is the animal, right? We covered that before. Just as the eye isn't just an eyeball, nor is it just the power of sight, but it's both together, a certain corporeal bit plus the power to see. So the animal is the body plus the soul that causes that body to exist. It's not just the soul. So the idea that you are your soul and that there's some kind of problem with that, it just doesn't have any force against the Aristotelian tradition at all, because we are not our souls on this view. And lastly, I might mention immateriality. Now, it may look like Blackmore and Harris have us on immateriality. If by immateriality, I mean non-corporeality, right? Non-bodiliness. Then clearly the soul on the Aristotelian tradition is immaterial. It's not a body. It's a substantial form and feature of a body. Feature is not the best word, but it's certainly not a body. And so in that sense, it's immaterial. But I would propose that this is just a non-problematic idea of immateriality. Take a basketball. In part, it's rubber on the hylomorphic view, and in part, it's sphericity, right? It's its sphericalness. Clearly, its shape is not the rubber. And if the rubber is the material, then the shape is immaterial, i.e. not material. But that's not problematic, right? Just because I affirm that the shape is not the rubber, I'm not affirming anything crazy. I'm not affirming that souls can, or that shapes can exist independently of any possible medium, right? They're always going to be in some matter. So in this view, all accidents, whether they're accidents of everyday things in the world, like cats or trees, or whether they're accidents of electrons, like negative charge. Negative charge is immaterial, if by that we mean it's not the electron whose charge it is. So I don't see any problem here with the kind of immateriality that's proposed by the Aristotelian, not one that should bring us into any serious problems. So now there's a lot to say more here about the human being, because some of the things I've said here require special attention in the human case, because in the human case, according to both Aristotle and Aquinas anyway, there is an act which the soul itself performs. So we would have to talk a whole lot more about that, if we wanted to get clear on its meaning. But it's still, I would say, unproblematic, generally speaking, because the best way of speaking is to say that Socrates thinks with his soul, not that his soul thinks. So questions about the human being in particular set aside for right now. I conclude that there's nothing in these popular presentations by Harris and Blackmore that's particularly damning to the notion of soul in general, because there is certainly something that answers to soul if there's a difference between living and non-living things. And there is a difference between living and non-living things. So there's definitely something that answers to the name of soul. Nor is what they have to say particularly damning to the Aristotelian tradition. They just miss the mark when they're talking about the soul as performing operations and the soul as being the individual or the person. That's nothing anyone has ever said in the Aristotelian tradition. And the kind of immateriality that we are talking about with the soul is a completely non-problematic form. So, don't give up hope. There's good reason to think that you have a soul, and that the things that are said against it in these popular attacks anyway really have no force. Thank you, John.
Dr. Squires, that was really, really interesting. Here's my question right off. So let me start off. We've started to get a few questions, and so feel free, if you are on Zoom, just throw your question right here in the question box. We have some assistants here that are kind of gathering them all together. Even if you're on Facebook or YouTube, feel free to throw, and you're not logged into Zoom, feel free to throw a question in the thread, in the video thread. We'll try to get to that. We'll try to get to that as well. So here's one. The rhetoric in the video from Blackmore and Harris seemed to rely a lot on the audience's intuition. I loved your comment about giving a standing ovation for, nothing after death. I mean, it seemed to be lost on them. But they themselves, question continues, but they themselves acknowledge the intuition of every culture was that there was a soul, and that they are bringing in science to say something counterintuitive. So do you think in 2021, there's this kind of unproven intuition that science has disproved a soul, and maybe there might be some kind of a problem for people these days?
I think it probably depends on the folks that are, that we're talking about. Professional philosophers on the whole aren't really keen to talk about what Blackmore or Harris are saying, or some of them are. It just depends on which tradition of the soul that they're talking about. Aristotelians aren't too keen to talk to them about it because they just know many of the things that I'm here presenting popularly to our audience. But yeah, I think it depends on who you're talking to. I encounter a lot of students that have been very profoundly affected by what I would call YouTube atheism, or in this case, YouTube apsychism, right? Like the ideas that science answers all, empirical science, like physics or biology, answer all the questions that we can ask, and there simply isn't anything to know beyond those fields. I certainly disagree with that. From my Aristotelian perspective, I think that philosophy includes a number of sciences, including logic, natural philosophy, metaphysics. But yes, I do think that there's a lot of people have been affected by this sort of thinking. It just depends, I guess, on whether the culture that they're in is one that really appreciates science, in which sometimes we find people who, seeing what science has achieved, think that there's just nothing else to know other than, what science could tell us, what empirical sciences could tell us, or quantitative empirical sciences even. I do think in cultures like ours, it's more common for people to have those ideas. Now, if you went somewhere else where that's not appreciated in the same way, I don't know that there would still be a strong intuition. I suspect that there's something about us that transcends matter.
Do you get the sense that, I mean, they're in a sense, they're not even really responding to, the best arguments. So what does that either say about their philosophical acumen, or just simply their desire to keep it on a popular level because this stuff works so well popularly?
I think that, yeah, maybe the answer to that's different for different people. Like sometimes people Richard Dawkins, for example, has had prominent, important philosophers respond to him publicly. And he kind of keeps on saying things without addressing those concerns. That seems like kind of hard-headedness or a desire to, keep it popular rather than engage. But another issue, I don't know that Blackmore or Harris are bad actors. I just don't think that, most people's conception of the soul, even in contemporary philosophy, is probably something somewhat Cartesian, right? In which case, it does look like that people are saying that the soul is something that performs operations and is identical to the individual. Now, as Father Raphael pointed out 2 weeks ago, I think even people who affirm that might be able to have something to say against Blackmore or Harris. But personally, I don't know that it would be anything all that convincing. I think that if that's what you're saying a soul is, then some of what they're saying is pretty damning to the position. But I just don't know that Aristotelianism, especially in its classical form, is widespread enough in contemporary philosophy, particularly contemporary analytic philosophy, for it to be widely known what Aristotelians say about the soul. So I don't know that Harris or Blackmore are bad actors. But if they do know some of the things which I've said here, which are just very basic features of Aristotelianism, then they ought to respond to the better form, right? I mean, if I put a scarecrow up in my backyard and beat it senseless and then claim to have beaten Mike Tyson, well, that's not going to be very convincing, right? Take on the best form that you can take on.
Right. I was thinking too, as you were kind of wrapping up your talk, now we've had an hour and a half between you and Father of an excellent overview of the soul. And you guys have patiently unfolded, concept after concept to develop the idea. And it takes a while. I mean, this has taken, an hour and a half of just even, dealing with this on the most remedial level. And essentially they're doing deconstruction, and deconstruction is just by nature, it's quick and easy work, and it works in 30-second sound bites, and, we can play that. And it's much more difficult to make this case.
It is. And I don't think that even the time that we have here to talk about it is adequate to the tasks, right? So teaching this in Philosophy of the Human Person, we just covered, 6 weeks of or more of a philosophy class in a single sitting. So if some of this didn't make sense to you, that's probably partially my fault. I could always be a better speaker than I am. But it's also just the fact that we're trying to condense this material into such a tiny space that it's difficult to get it across. The way to remedy that for yourself is to get some more popular books if you want to read more. Like, for example, Ed Fazer's book, Aquinas, A Beginner's Guide. That's a great way to learn a little bit more about what I've been talking about here tonight, without, having to read the Summa cover to cover or something like that.
All right, I got another question. What if I just don't think there's a real difference between living and non-living things? Computers are extremely complicated, and I don't understand how they work. They do stuff that rocks don't do and couldn't even really be imagined to do. But I don't feel motivated to posit a principle of computerhood or something. Why not just think that living things are analogous to computers, except that they evolved naturalistically somehow? Let's assume that the first very simple thing that could evolve naturalistically somehow came into being naturalistically.
Yeah. I'm sorry, could you read the beginning of that again?
Yeah. What if I just don't think there's a real difference between living and non-living things? And i.e. computers are just complicated and I don't understand how they work. They do stuff that rocks don't do.
Well, I think the first thing to say here is that, well, at least as far as conscious operations go, I want to know whether the author of the question is denying their own conscious experience, or, for example, attributing conscious experience to, perception or imagination or thought to computers. Because if they're attributing those things to computers, well, if they have those operations and those are living operations, then I think they're alive. Whether that's possible or not is an interesting question in philosophy. On the other hand, if the person is denying that they have any conscious experience at all, I actually had a student who did this. Ironically, his nickname was Critter. He said he once was talking about Google streetcars, and he was saying that they see. And I said, well, they don't see, right? There's nothing that it's like to be a Google streetcar. And he said, oh, well, I'm not saying that they have experiences like me. I'm saying that I don't have experiences. And I think even people there's a couple videos by Harris actually where, he takes the side of philosophers like Chalmers and other philosophers of philosophers of mind, that certainly there is something that it's like to be a bat, right? There is something that it's like to be a human being, that there are states that we have that are conscious states. So I do think that there's a difference between living and non-living things, and it's because some of them perform living operations. We'd have to deny the existence of those operations. Now, what that principle has to be, that is something that we could much more debate. If someone wanted to say, look, I don't think I need your substantial form in order to account for that principle. I'll account for it just with the powers themselves. Maybe the power to see is something that emerges from a material state. okay, well, that person I'd have to have a much more complicated philosophical talk with, right? So I don't demand that it's substantial form. I only present that that's what Aristotle says it is here, and that Blackmore and Harris have they have nothing to say against that position. But for people who have alternative views of it, I welcome that you introduce some other principle, and then we talk about which does a better job as that principle. But I do think there is a difference between living and non-living things, and that it requires something as an explanation, even if not substantial form. I hope that was a little bit helpful too.
No, I think it was.
That's a great question, by the way. I appreciate that question.
Okay, what are the next question is neuroscience is often presented almost as kind of the final religion that's going to explain everything in terms of anthropology, but what are its limits, and how can we kind of circumscribe what it can and cannot do?
Well, gosh, I wish I were a neuroscientist to better answer the question. I'm not sure exactly what the limits of neuroscience are, qua neuroscience, but clearly, I think some of the questions we've discussed here today are not neuroscientific questions. We've been discussing something like the unity of substantial bodies. And it's usually philosophers of nature or metaphysicians, ontologists, who are discussing those questions. If anything, science seems to take the unity of its objects for granted, right? If you're a scientist of squirrels, you don't ask how it's possible that there could be non-elemental bodies, namely squirrels. You just assume that there are squirrels, and then you start to study them. You leave it for the philosopher to inquire into those particular sorts of questions. Anyway,
Good.
So I might tie that back to the video when Harris says that it's open to the scientist to discover the soul. Maybe, it's running like software and it could get into some kind of ectoplasm. I don't think that any science other than philosophy could possibly get at substantial form, right? Like, what would you open a body and look around for it? Well, the only thing that's in bodies are parts of bodies, in that sense of in, anyway. So yeah, I'm not particularly moved by that. I'm not particularly moved by people who think that neuroscience or physics even could answer every kind of question.
Yeah.
I find the question about the unity of bodies extremely highly intelligible.
Right.
So, show me which empirical scientist is talking about this question, and I'll see what they have on offer in their science to answer it.
Yeah,
I think you'll find that they aren't talking about it. I'm talking about it, and so are my colleagues.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. You brought up a point that I was going to bring up. I was wondering, I haven't seen that video before of Dr. Blackmore, and I was wondering where she was going to go when she was making this kind of great theatrical appeal to.
Isn't she great? I love her.
Yeah, it was effective to common human experience. And you know what I thought right away? I mean, of course, you almost, you're kind of embarrassed suddenly when, she kind of throws common experience, kind of under the bus as well. We just can do away with all that now. But I was thinking, a basic philosophy text for somebody that's interested in how does a Thomist even give an account of the soul or some of these principles you were discussing, and also kind of make this appeal, although not as a primary argument, to basic the totality of human experience is Norris Clarke in The One and the Many, which is just students basic as an introductory text. I found scores of students really help that it clarifies things. Do you find that approach helpful? Is that a book that, or that also adds something to Fazer's text?
I'm not all that familiar, so I couldn't tell you that. As to Blackmore's, I also didn't catch the name. Which text were you talking about?
Norris Clarke, The One and the Many.
Oh, I have heard of that. I have not looked through it myself. I'm sorry, so I can't give an opinion on it. As far as Blackmore talking about intuitions, did you think that she was even correct about our intuitions? She says, it just seems like you're something living in your body. Well, some of our speech sounds like that, right? I'd say that I have a body, and you usually don't think of the things that you have as, you don't think of yourself as identical to things you have, right? Yeah. I have a raspberry in my hand. Well, then I'm not the raspberry, right? But on the other hand, we also talk about ourselves as undergoing things that are bodily. So I say, I grew up. If I wasn't even a body in part, then you'd have to say my body grew up, right?
Mhm.
So
Yeah, the thing I think that she said at one point when I was wondering where she was going, she said, I think she said something like, "Well, I feel it or something, so I'm just me. I'm me," which made me think, all right, I mean, is there some kind of unity to this? But of course, that's not where she is going. So that was the point. All right, let's go on to the next one. I read once in a Catholic literature that the soul encompasses the body. No? Question mark.
no. It encompasses the body. Encompass usually means surround. So in that sense, I would say no. It can't encompass the body. In fact, it might be better to speak of the body being in the soul than the soul in the body. If the soul is in the body, it's certainly not in the body in the way that wine is in a cup, right? Where the body is around it. I mean, when we see cartoons, there's always sort of the dead person, the ghost sits up out of the dead man. Well, then it's just like another body in your body, right? That's clearly not what we mean by the soul. The soul doesn't have parts in that way. It's simple. Every part of the body has one and the same soul existing in it. And if any part of the body did not have one and the same soul existing in it, then because the soul causes the body to exist, that wouldn't be part of the body, right? And this is what we might call Aristotle's homonymy principle, which is a fancy word for saying in name only, right? A lopped off finger is not a finger because it no longer has the principle of human existence present to it. Now, this is not Aristotle word policing us, right? I mean, if I chop my finger off with the bandsaw and the paramedics show up and they say, "Where's the finger?" I don't say, "What finger?" Right? I say, "Oh, it's in the fridge." But if a philosopher comes along and tells me that chopped off fingers are fingers, well, then we have to talk, right? The paramedic can speak as they please. The philosopher has to be precise about these things. So if there were a part of my body that didn't have my soul in it, it wouldn't be a part of my body, right? In fact, there are quote unquote parts of my body that are not ensouled, presumably like hair, right? I mean, it's really not growing, it's dead. And so when we call those things parts of our body, we mean sort of like they came from our living body, but not that they are parts of it in the way that living flesh or living bone is a part of my substance. Complicated stuff.
Okay, next one. You said that Harris and Blackmore's views indicate that the soul does not survive death because all of its supposed operations are in the body. A good question. How does the Aristotelian view allow the soul surviving death?
Right, that's a good question. This is kind of what I didn't talk about here. And it's a shame we didn't have a third lecture on this where someone actually tackled this question, because people were asking Father Raphael the same sort of thing. In the Aristotelian, or especially clearly in the Thomistic tradition, maybe debatably in the Aristotelian tradition, the soul of the rational animal, namely the human being, is something which can survive the death of the body. Now, most forms can't do that, right? What happens to the shape in a piece of straight bronze when I bend it with my philosopher's strength? Does it go, to straightness heaven, where all straightnesses go when bronze is bent? We don't even ask questions like that. We just say like, no, it doesn't, right? It just doesn't exist anymore. Now there's roundness where straightness used to be in the bronze. The soul, in most cases on the Thomistic view, is like that. Just as when the bronze is bent, the straightness does not continue to exist anywhere. So when the living body is dead, the soul does not go on to exist anywhere afterwards. Now, the human case is a special case, and this comes down to the idea that the human soul has its own operation, and that would be abstract thought in the case of Aquinas. Or maybe I shouldn't call it that. I'll just thinking. And what he has in mind here is the grasping of essences, the forming of propositional truths, and then syllogizing. These are things which we can say that the soul itself performs. In fact, on this view, though it's best to say that Socrates thinks, it's not totally wrong to say that the soul thinks. In fact, on this view, the soul is a kind of, I would say, incorporeal organ, kind of like a hand or a liver, right? But it all comes down to, for Aquinas, it comes down to the question of whether or not any souls have their own operations. And for Alice's soul, her soul doesn't have any operations, right? Because her soul is not sensing. It's certainly not thinking. It's not imagining. It's not doing any of those operations. It's a principle of those operations, right? Because forms can be principles of operations. Just like I said about the heart, right? The heart is the agent that's pumping the blood. Health is the form by which it performs its operation. Likewise, for Alice, the cat, Alice, is the thing that's performing the conscious operations of sensing, imagining, etc. And the soul is that form by which the cat performs those operations, but the soul does not perform those operations itself. And as such, since it doesn't have its own operation, it doesn't have existence in its own right. So it's not going to survive the destruction of the animal body. So it all comes down to the question of whether it's true that in the human case, the soul has its own operation. And the arguments for that are very complicated and a little beyond the scope of a short talk like this.
Okay, here's a bit of a theology question. That was triggered by one of our listeners regarding your analogy with your girlfriend. Okay, so if the unity then in the theology question in the order of grace, I'm guessing, if there's not a substantial union between obviously these two beings, what kind of union does the sacrament of marriage engender?
Good. Well, some philosophers actually do claim that it's a substantial union. These are new natural lawyers who I think should have a better view than they do on this. It's a kind of unity of like order, right? It's a kind of there are other sorts of unity, right? I mean, we can say about being glued together that's a kind of unity, right? It's more unified than not being glued together, but it's not substantial unity. And likewise, we can say that marriage is a sacramental unity, but not a substantial unity.
That's I think we have our talk. Maybe next year, if you and Father can come back, maybe we need to do natural law or something, and in particular the new natural law notion of substance, which might need a little bit of drawing out.
Well, it's interesting stuff. I mean, I think what they're onto is the fact that the reproductive powers are not complete in the sexes, right? So like, I do not have the reproductive power on my own,
right?
Nor does any woman. And so because of that incompleteness of the power, I think that leads them to this idea. But I don't think the incompletion of that power in me entails anything about me and a wife being substantially one being. That doesn't seem, I want to see a pretty solid argument for that.
I mean, and what would that have any implications for the notion of the soul then, right?
I mean, yes, right. I mean, so like, this is a good thing for you to point out. There can only be one substantial form or soul, if we're talking about living things, in a body. If there were two souls in one animal body, it wouldn't be one animal body, because the soul is a principle of the existence of a body. So this is often called the unicity of form. There can only be one substantial form. It's like Highlander, right? There can only be one. And that's because if the body is really going to be one, there can't be more than one principle of existence. You'd end up with two bodies instead of one. So yeah, if I'd want to know what people were saying, if they thought that a husband and wife were one substance, well, what are we to say about their souls? I mean, are their souls no longer two? Well, gosh, how then could one be blessed and the other damned? I think we need to just abandon the idea that husbands and wives are one substance. That's my thesis anyway.
All right. You have time for one more?
Sure.
Okay. So there's a couple different parts to this one. And I think it gets into then a big question. So the first thing is, do dogs have souls? But then let me say, are animal souls different from human souls? The second part of the question is then, so do souls evolve? Prehistoric dog souls different from dog souls now, et cetera. And of course, I'm guessing that might get to the big evolution question. Different cultures say different things about this.
That's a bunch of questions all in one. You snuck that one in on me. You got time for one more, then he gives me 6.
It was at the end. That was not my fault.
So I think, there's a bunch of interesting questions about Aristotelianism and evolution. I think the answer, like just going in order from what I remember here, yes, dogs have souls. They are different and not different than, say, other kinds of souls. Like they're different in that a particular kind of soul brings into existence a particular kind of body, right? From seed, what grows in living things is a certain kind of body, right? This is one reason Aristotle doesn't believe in like the transmigration of souls as Plato did, because each soul has its own particular body which it causes to exist and to grow to some end and to have for the sake of having organs of a certain kind, so that the powers that it grants to the body have their proper organ to exist in. To think of a crow soul existing in a human body, for Aristotle would be like thinking that, he uses the analogy of the arts, right? Thinking that carpentry could exist in flutes, right? Carpentry, a certain form, a certain kind of knowledge, right? It needs particular kinds of tools in order to do its work, right? And flutes aren't the right kind of tools. Try to do some carpentry with flutes. You won't get very far. So just as every art requires its own tools, so every soul requires its own organic body. In fact, organ in Greek just means tool, right? So I definitely think that dogs have souls and that they differ in kind and species. Now, they're just parts of a species, because what the species is the dog. Now, about the question of evolution, I don't think that Aristotle certainly didn't believe in it. He thought that there were always just examples of every species existing at any time. But I don't think that it's really a problem to fit hylomorphism to the theory of evolution. You do need to have some way in which species are discrete. Souls would not be evolving, right? Souls are forms, and forms are principles of change, but they themselves aren't changing. So if a new kind of animal was spawned from another due to some kind of mutation or something like that, it would have, if it really were truly a different species, it would have a different kind of form as its principle. Now, exactly where you have a new species, right, and a new substantial form, or whether you have one of the same species kind and the differences can be accounted for in terms of accidental differences like shape and size and things like that, that's a very difficult question. So all these questions about form and evolution are fascinating, and people who work on hylomorphic theory and think that it's worth talking about, they ought to address questions like this, perhaps just not in any great detail in a short talk like this.
Yeah. Dr. Squires, I'm sorry, you got one more that's come in. Is a soul connected to a person's identity? How so? As unique as, say, a person's DNA?
Yeah, I mean, good question. I think that I'm a Thomist, and so I think that really when it comes down to identity, what I'd like to say is that esse, or existence, is sort of the root of identity. And esse comes to the composite being, soul and body, through the form. And so I do think that, your soul is, that principle of existence is something that is certainly uniquely yours, right? It's not anyone else's soul. But oftentimes when people are asking these questions about uniqueness, they're not talking about numerical identity, right? They're not asking just whether John's soul and my soul are one and the same soul. And that's what I've just said. No, certainly they are numerically different souls. They're asking questions about like personality, and that uses soul in a much looser sense, right? Like John's got soul, right? Here I don't mean a substantial form, but I mean like he's got a certain way about him, right? He dresses good or something. He dresses right. He likes he likes to put peanut butter in his Cheerios. He's got these unique features about him. When we're talking about things like that, we're not talking about soul in the Aristotelian sense, but a kind of extended idea of it.
Perfect. One negative about this talk that I think you're going to have to fix later is my wife is texting me, and now you've converted her to new natural law on this substantial unity of the marriage. So I'm going to leave you to sort that one out.
Wait, I converted her away from it or to it?
Towards it with this, this idea of a one substance. Yeah, exactly. Right.
Oh, I see. Well, I certainly didn't mean to do that.
No, I'm being playful. She was texting me, joking that she likes this, whatever this is, she likes it. But
so if you are one substance and you disagree with her position on this, can one substance hold contradictory opinions at the same time?
Yeah.
It's an interesting question. I suppose if one substance could have two minds, then one mind could think X and the other not X. But, if there's only one mind, then it would be impossible.
Well, Dr. Squires, that was fantastic. Really a lot of fun and very enlightening. And, when I'm going to keep this will be up on YouTube. It'll be right next to Father Raphael's talk, and this is a great 1-2 punch. I know Father Raphael was I saw him tuning in, so hopefully we can keep this going. This will also be up on Facebook. It was really a lot of fun, and thanks so much for giving up your evening and doing all the preparation for this.
Thank you for inviting me. I was glad to do it, and I'm glad to. I guess I'm the last speaker, so I'm the train car on it.
No, you're just barely over halfway.
Oh, yeah. I thought it was, I'm sorry. I did not know that. So no. So next week, that leads up to our next discussion next point of discussion is Dr. Thomas Harmon, what is surely to be a fantastic lecture on St. Augustine, how not to look for God, clues from St. Augustine. Now, remember, we're going to go, I know people are traveling, especially during July. We're going strong though, all the way till August 4th. We've got Sister Chow Nguyen, our Dominican sister. She's on the theology faculty here on the Virgin Mary. We have on July 21st, Dr. Andrew Hayes on St. Ephraim. On July 28th, we have Sister Albert Marie Szymanski on Albert the Great on Eucharistic Beauty. And then closing it out, it's a fitting closure because Dr. Dominic Aquila, will be doing John Henry Newman's Development of Doctrine to kind of, we've been doing so much on tradition and development. So Dr. Harmon here next Wednesday on Augustine, how not to look for God, clues from St. Augustine. Dr. Squires, have a fantastic week, great summer, and thanks again for joining us. Thank you. Have a good one, John.
Appreciate it.